The candles in Lord Penworth's drawing-room had been burning for 2 hours, and the heat of them, combined with the heat of 40 well-dressed bodies, had produced the particular atmosphere that passed for elegance in the second week of the London season. Close air, competing perfumes, and the sound of a soprano singing something Italian that no one in the room was listening to. Miss Nora Ashby stood near the pianoforte with her employer's shawl draped over one arm and watched the door to the servants' corridor. She had not meant to look there. She had been looking at the vase of early hothouse roses on the far mantelpiece, which were beginning to droop in the warmth, and her gaze had traveled without intention to the narrow door set into the paneling, and then to the slice of corridor visible through it, and then to the figure in the corridor. A man in a coat that had once been respectable, now several degrees past repair, standing with his hat in both hands, and speaking to a footman who was shaking his head in the measured way of footmen paid to make rejections look like regret. Nora knew that hat. She knew the particular angle of those shoulders, slightly rounded at the top, the posture of a man who had once been comfortable indoors and could no longer remember precisely how to stand. Jonas Finch. She had not seen him in 4 years. She had hoped she would not see him for 4 more. She turned away from the door before the footman could close it. And when she turned, she found that someone was already watching her. He stood at the far end of the room, close enough to the candlelight that she could see his face clearly. A man in his middle 30s, dark-coated, with a jaw that the candlelight rendered in planes rather than curves, and eyes that had been resting on her with the precise, deliberate attention of someone who was not watching the soprano at all. He did not look away when she noticed him. He simply held her gaze for a moment, 2 moments, then returned his eyes to the room as though she had never looked up. Nora's heart beat once, hard against her ribs. She did not know his name yet. She did not need to. She knew, with the particular instinct of someone who had spent 24 years learning to read a room's weather, that the evening had just changed. The shawl in her arms seemed suddenly heavier. She smoothed it with both hands and turned back to the pianoforte, and did not look at the door again. The soprano reached her high note. The candles continued to burn. She had come to London in the first week of February as companion to Mrs. Dorothea Lyle, the wife of a minor country baronet who wanted company for the season without the expense of a friend of rank. She was exactly the right price. The daughter of a country clergyman who had died leaving a small library, a neat handwriting, and £300 of debts. She had educated herself on the library and settled the debts with the first 2 seasons of companionship, and she had learned, in those 2 seasons, to stand near pianofortes with shawls on her arm and make herself into something between a furniture piece and a useful shadow. She was good at it. She had learned to be good at it young. The position paid £12 a year, which was not enough, and more than nothing, and came with use of a room that was neither warm nor cold. A seat at table on the evening's Mrs. Liesel went out, and the understanding that Nora was neither a servant nor a guest, but something the social machinery of the season had not entirely worked out how to classify. She sat with the ladies when the ladies sat. She stood near the shawls when the shawls required standing near. She listened to conversations that were not addressed to her, absorbed information that was not intended for her, and returned to her small room each evening having compiled, in the back portion of her mind, a thorough account of everyone who had been present, what they had wanted, and what they had only appeared to want. She did not enjoy this. She was very good at it. There is a distinction. Growing up in Fenby, in the West Riding, a clergyman's daughter accumulated exactly 2 assets worth having: a thorough reading of Scripture and knowledge of everybody's business within 12 miles. Her father had kept meticulous records. Every birth, every marriage, every burial, and every whispered arrangement that preceded or followed any of these 3 events had been entered in his ledger in a hand so careful you would have thought he understood, even then, that the information was dangerous. Margaret Finch had been baptized in the church of St. Cuthbert Fenby in the autumn of 1789. Her father was Thomas Finch, a tallow chandler of middling trade and poor temper. Her mother was Anne Finch, born Harker, of no particular family. Nora had watched Margaret Finch grow from a stout and clever child into a stout and clever young woman who possessed, along with her stoutness and her cleverness, a quality that the village could not name but could not help noticing, a composure so complete it read, from certain angles, as breeding. Margaret had always carried herself like a woman who believed she deserved more room than the world was currently affording her. Fenby had found this presumptuous. Nora had found it accurate. The Duke of Carwell had met her at his land agent's house in the north, where Margaret was employed as a housekeeper's assistant. He had proposed within the season. He had not, apparently, asked the questions one might have thought to ask. Or he had asked them and received answers that satisfied him. Or his mother, Lady Gresham, had smoothed over the answers before they reached him. What Lady Gresham had certainly done was present Margaret to society as the daughter of a gentleman farmer from Northumberland with modest connections and no surviving family, and the season, which had other things to discuss, had accepted this accounting without particular scrutiny. What was certain was plain. Margaret Finch was now Her Grace the Duchess of Carwell, and had been for 3 years, and her origins were either unknown to the Duke or had ceased to matter to him, and either way the subject was closed. She had not returned to Fenby. She had not corresponded with her brother Jonas. She had, as far as Nora could determine, quietly and systematically excised the first 20 years of her life and built something durable on the cleared ground. Nora had never blamed her. She understood, at a cellular level, the desire to become someone the world could not reduce with a single sentence. What she had not anticipated was Jonas. If this question of what a secret costs and who pays for it has ever sat with you, then stay a moment longer. The story is just beginning to turn. Nora returned to those words later, standing in the corridor outside the drawing room with the shawl still on her arm. She had slipped out during the interval between the soprano's first and second set, telling Mrs. Liesel she wanted air. She had wanted, in truth, to find the servant's door and confirm what she feared. Jonas was gone from the corridor. The footman was polishing a lamp with the absorbed concentration of someone who had been told to see nothing and had decided this instruction extended to the previous half hour as well. Whatever conversation had taken place had ended without result. She turned to go back inside and found the dark-coated man from across the room standing directly in her path. He was taller than he had appeared at a distance. The jaw was as she had noted, carved-looking, spare, with a slight tension at the hinge that suggested the composed expression was maintained rather than natural. The eyes, up close, were gray, and they did not appear surprised to find her here. "You looked at the servant's door," he said. His voice was low and level, the words placed with the quiet deliberateness of a man who did not use more of them than he required. "Twice." At the same moment, the footman was speaking to someone in the corridor. She met his gaze. "I was admiring the paneling." Something shifted near the corner of his mouth. It was not precisely amusement. It was the expression of a man who has heard a reasonable answer and is noting that it is not the true one. "The paneling," he said. "It is very fine work," Nora said. "Late Stuart, I would think, though the inlay may have been replaced." You can see the variation in the grain near the lower rail. A pause. He looked at the lower rail of the paneling beside them. Then he looked back at her. He regarded her with the steady, patient attention of a man who was willing to wait, and who understood that waiting was often more informative than pressing. "Edmund Vane," he said. "Marquis of Atherstone." She dipped her head. "Miss Nora Ashby." "You are companion to Mrs. Liesel." "I am." "And before London?" She looked at him steadily. "Fenby," she said. "In the West Riding. My father was the clergyman there." It was the truth, every word of it. She had learned long ago that the best concealment was a truth that did not require the complete picture. She had also learned, in the same long education, that a man asking directed questions in a corridor had not arrived at those questions by accident. He was looking for something. She did not yet know the precise shape of what he had come to find, but she knew she was standing close to it. Lord Atherstone held her gaze for another moment. Then he stepped aside. "Miss Ashby," he said. And the neutrality of it was so careful that she could not determine whether it was a dismissal or an invitation. And she chose, as she always chose, to treat it as a dismissal. She went back into the drawing room. Lady Gresham was seated near the fire in a chair that was not formally a throne but had been arranged to suggest one, fan held at an angle that managed to be both casual and regal, her eyes traveling across the room with the practiced survey of a woman who had spent 40 years cataloging her social inventory. She was dressed in deep wine-colored silk, and her jewels were significant enough to constitute a statement. Beside her, arranged with the natural ease of a woman placed exactly where she was intended to be, sat Lady Cecily Mordaunt in ice blue, young, polished, and possessed of the particular serenity that came from having never been told, even once, that she was in the wrong room. As Nora passed behind the row of chairs, she heard Lady Gresham's fan close. "That creature with the shawl," Lady Gresham said, not quietly enough, to the woman beside her. "Mrs. Liesel's companion, a country nobody. The kind that watches doors at parties." Lady Cecily glanced in Nora's direction, with the gracious incuriosity of someone for whom other women in plain gowns did not fully exist, and returned her attention to Lady Gresham with the faint, well-bred smile of a woman receiving information she did not especially need. Nora adjusted the shawl on her arm and continued walking. She kept the shawl very still. This was the thing she was best at. The interior held absolutely motionless, while the surface remained composed. Her father had taught her this without meaning to. He had been a gentleman who carried difficult information and demonstrated daily that the weight of it could be managed if you learned to be quiet about it. He had been so quiet, in the end, that the secret had had to make its own noise, and it had done so at the worst possible time, and cost him his living and very nearly his health, and he had died in the 3rd year of his reduced circumstances, still believing that he should have been quieter. She had inherited the instinct. She had spent 24 years perfecting it. Jonas came back the following afternoon. Nora had been sent to arrange the flowers in the front hall, while Mrs. Liesel rested, which was a task that occupied her hands and left her mind entirely free, which was both the gift and the difficulty of her position. She heard the knock at the kitchen entrance, a sound distinct in timbre from the polished knock at the front door, and she heard the housekeeper's footsteps cross the flagged floor below, and she heard, through the kitchen window that was ajar to let out the smell of baking bread, a low voice she recognized. She was down the back stairs before the housekeeper had finished telling him there was no one here who would see him. "I will see him," Nora said. The housekeeper's expression indicated this was irregular. "Please," Nora added, and something in the word was enough to move her. Jonas Finch, at 41, looked like a man who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time. His coat was the one she had noted the previous evening, the collar turned up against a cold that was already past, the buttons mismatched in a way that suggested they had been replaced more than once over a long deterioration. His hat was not on his head. He held it in both hands, which was not, she understood, a gesture of deference, but the behavior of a man who needed something to grip. His face was thinner than she remembered it from Fenby. She could see, in the particular sharpness around the eyes, that he had been frightened for some time. The kind of long, low, sustained fear that eventually stops feeling like fear and starts feeling like weather. "Miss Ashby," he said. "Nora." He caught himself. "Forgive me." "It is all right," she said. They had been children together, after a fashion. He 10 years older than her. The Finch house on the far side of the village. But Fenby was small enough that 10 years and 2 social stations collapsed into a general familiarity at the level of who knew whose chickens and whose fence wanted mending. "Come into the garden, Jonas. Come out of the street." She sat him on the bench inside the walled garden at the back of the Liesel house, a modest garden, cold still, with the brown remains of last year's lavender along the wall and a few early bulbs just pressing through the soil, and she gave him the coins she had in her pocket, which were not many, and watched him close his hand around them with the care of a man who has not been given something without condition for some time. She did not ask him what he needed. She asked him what he knew. He had not meant to say anything, he told her. He had been in the park, near the Strand, at the edge of things, and a man had pressed a coin into his hand and asked, easily, casually, as though it did not much matter. He had asked whether Jonas knew anything of the Finch family, of the West Riding Finches. And Jonas, who was tired and hungry and had been both of these things for long enough that his judgment had worn thin, could not think of a reason, after all this time, why it should matter. He had said that his sister had married a duke. The man had asked which duke. Jonas had told him. The man had thanked him and walked away. 3 days later, Jonas had found himself watched, a figure at the corner of the street, present in the morning, present in the evening, gone when he looked directly at it. 2 nights ago, he had been followed from the common lodging house where he slept. He had not gone back. He had come to Nora because hers was the only address in London he knew, copied from the direction of a letter she had sent their mutual acquaintance Mrs. Hartley of Fenby 4 months ago, and because she was the clergyman's daughter, and because clergymen's daughters, in his experience, were the only people who kept their heads when everyone else was losing theirs. He did not ask her to do anything. He only told her, with the plain exhaustion of a man who has been silent too long, and has decided that silence is no longer keeping him safe, in any case. She sat for a moment after he had finished, looking at the bare earth at her feet, where the early bulbs were pushing through with the patient industry of things that do not know they are early. Then she told him to go to the coffee house on the corner of Bernard Street and wait there, and she would send word. "They will find me," he said. "Not before I find them," she said. She did not know if this was true. She knew it was the first thing she had said in months that felt like herself. Lord Atherstone found her in the garden 20 minutes after Jonas had gone. She heard his boots on the gravel path and turned before he spoke. She was not surprised. She recognized now the particular quality of his attention the night before. The gaze that had followed her to the servant's door was not casual interest. It was professional attention. He was looking for something, and she was standing at the edge of it. "You gave money to the man who was just here," he said. He stood at the entrance to the garden, at the correct distance of a man who has not been invited further in. She looked at him steadily. "I give money to people who need it, when I have it to give." "You knew him?" He did not phrase it as a question. She noted this. A long silence. She was aware of the garden's particular quiet. The sounds of the street beyond the wall reduced to a low, constant murmur. The way the pale February light lay flat across the cold ground. The distant sound of a cart horse somewhere on the next street. She was aware, as well, of the way he stood, absolutely still, with the quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has learned to wait without fidgeting, to watch without appearing to watch, to occupy a space without claiming it unnecessarily. "Lord Atherstone," she said, "why are you looking for Jonas Finch?" She saw it, the small alteration in his expression at the name. Not surprise exactly. It was the expression of a man registering that the situation has shifted in a direction he had not anticipated, but is prepared to follow. He crossed the garden and sat on the bench she had vacated. He looked at his hands, which were clasped between his knees, and then he looked at her. "I was asked by the Duke of Carwell," he said, "to locate the source of a rumor that had reached the edges of the season. A suggestion that Her Grace's family connections might not be what was stated at the time of the marriage." "And you agreed," Nora said. "The Duke is a man I have been glad to call a friend for many years. And when you located the source?" Another pause. She watched the decision being made, could see it in the way the tension around his eyes resolved itself into something plainer. "I was asked to ensure the matter was quietly resolved," he said. "Quietly resolved," she repeated. The words sat between them with their actual meaning visible, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "He is not malicious," she said. "He is not running a scheme against the Duchess or the Duke. He was hungry, and someone gave him a coin and asked the right question, and he was too tired to calculate the cost of answering it." "I know that," Lord Atherstone said. "Then what would resolving it look like?" He turned to look at her directly. The gray eyes in the afternoon light were more complicated than they had appeared by candlelight. There was something underneath the professional stillness. Something tired, she thought, in the way of a man who has been tired for long enough that he has stopped calling it by that name and has simply incorporated it into the structure of his daily life, the way a building incorporates a damaged wall. "Miss Ashby," he said, "are you yourself a source of the same information?" She held his gaze. She had made the decision already, in the garden, when she told Jonas she would find them before they found him. She had made it, and she had not yet tested it against the reality of a man across from her waiting for the answer. "I grew up in Fenby," she said. "My father baptized Margaret Finch when she was 3 days old. I am the only person in London, outside the Finch family itself, who knows her maiden name and can prove it." She had not spoken the words aloud before. Saying them felt like standing at the edge of a height, the particular physical sensation of having placed oneself somewhere that cannot be easily undone. He looked at her for a long time. "Then you are also in danger," he said. "I was aware of that," she said. The silence between them rearranged itself into something different. She had expected many things from this moment: impatience, the calculation of a man reevaluating the cost of a situation, perhaps the specific expression of someone who has just discovered that their tidy commission has become considerably less tidy. She had not expected the thing that crossed his face, which was something she could only identify as recognition, the look of a person who has seen something they did not know they were looking for. "Why tell me?" he said. "Because you will find it out regardless," she said. "And I would rather you hear it from me, plainly, than arrive at it by some indirect path that gives you less than the whole truth. I have seen what happens when people try to manage around the truth. It does not become easier to manage." He was quiet for a moment. A thrush sang in the bare lilac at the garden wall, a few clear notes, unhurried, carrying across the cold air. "My wife died 18 months ago," he said. He said it the way a man says something he has not said aloud recently, not with grief performed for an audience, but with the flat, careful delivery of words that have been sitting too long in a room without windows. In childbed, the child as well. A daughter. He looked at the ground. I undertook this commission because I required something to do, something with clear parameters and a defined end. The Duke trusted me with it, and I was glad to be trusted with something, because trust is, as it turns out, easier to manage than the alternative. He stopped. The thrush sang again. I am telling you this, he said, because you asked a question that no one else has thought to ask. You asked why I agreed to it. Everyone else has assumed the answer. She understood then what the tiredness was. She had seen it in her father in the last year of his life, carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who has carried something alone for so long that even the set of his shoulders has changed, the weight having grown so familiar, it is mistaken for posture. I am sorry, she said. It was all she said, and she meant it entirely, and she did not follow it with anything that would dilute it. He looked at her. She stayed where she was standing, hands clasped at her waist, the afternoon light lying flat across the garden. She did not offer more comfort than she had given. She knew from long observation that more was often less, and that the people who needed comfort most were frequently the least well served by its abundance. After a moment, he said, What would you have me do? If this question sits with you, if you have ever had to decide how much to tell a man who has the power to help or harm you both, then stay, because the answer she gave that afternoon is the answer that changed everything. Do not resolve it quietly, she said. Tell the Duke the truth. The whole truth. Tell him who his wife was, and that there is no evidence of deception on her part, only on the part of the people who arranged the match without asking the necessary questions. Tell him that his wife is the same woman he married, and that the name she was born with does not alter a single fact of who she is. She paused. And in the meantime, leave Jonas Finch alone. He has nothing to gain from causing harm and everything to lose from remaining visible. He will go quietly if he is given a reason to believe that quietly is possible. Lord Atherstone looked at her for a long moment. You understand, he said, that this approach will cost Lady Gresham considerably. Lady Gresham, Nora said, made a decision for other people that was not hers to make, and she has spent 3 years paying for it in the private currency of a woman who knows the account may be called due at any moment. A public accounting is not cruelty. It is only accuracy. Something happened in his face that she had not seen there before. She could not name it precisely. It was as though a thing that had been held at a slight angle for a long time had been very slightly corrected. He stood from the bench. Miss Ashby, he said. And then, with a formality that contained within it something other than formality, a deliberateness that she recognized as meaningful precisely because a man of his rank had no practical need for it. Nora. Her own name in his voice. She steadied herself with no visible motion, the way her father had taught her, the way she had been practicing all her life. She went inside. She did not watch him go. The blow came 3 days later. Lady Gresham had not waited. She had, as Nora would understand afterward, moved the moment she learned that Lord Atherstone had found and spoken privately with the woman from Fenby. She had sent a word to the constable who patrolled the area around the common lodging houses near Holborn. She had a constable available, the way some women of her rank had a particular solicitor available, a man whose usefulness had been established over years and whose discretion was a matter of mutual benefit. Jonas Finch had been taken up for vagrancy on a Tuesday morning and conveyed to the magistrate's office on Bow Street before noon. Nora learned of it from the housemaid who read the morning papers to Mrs. Liesel's cook over breakfast. She heard the name and the lodging house and the charge, and she sat down at the kitchen table without intending to, and the cook set a cup of tea in front of her without comment, which was its own kind of charity. The second piece of news struck harder. It arrived by way of a note pressed into her hand at the market by a woman she did not recognize, young and neatly dressed, who was gone around the corner before Nora had opened it. The note contained 3 lines in a handwriting she did not know, and what it told her was plain. Lord Atherstone had been seen at the magistrate's office that same morning, and he had, according to the clerk who had been present, confirmed the vagrancy charge. He had confirmed it. She stood in the market with the note in her hand and the noise of the stalls around her, and thought, with a steadiness she found surprising, that she had been wrong to trust him. She had given him the full truth, every piece of it, and he had taken it and given it to Lady Gresham's constable. And Jonas Finch was sitting in a magistrate's office because she had been foolish enough to believe that a man sent to resolve a matter quietly would choose instead to resolve it honestly. She had mistaken grief for conscience. She had mistaken quietness for integrity. She was, after all, a country nobody. Lady Gresham had been right about that, if nothing else. She folded the note very carefully and put it in her pocket, and went about the rest of the morning with extreme precision. It was Miss Clara Tilbury, a pleasant young woman who had known Mrs. Liesel since girlhood, who came to call that afternoon, and said, settling into the chair with the comfortable authority of someone delivering genuinely useful news, "The talk is all about Mrs. Liesel's companion, my dear." Lady Gresham said, at the Marchioness of Frome's card party this morning, that your Miss Ashby is a country nobody who has been stirring up trouble of the worst kind. Something about a Duchess and a family secret. She looked directly at Nora with the cheerful frankness of someone who did not understand that she was the subject of the sentence she was delivering. I cannot imagine what a companion from some Yorkshire village could know that would matter to anyone in particular. The third voicing, said in Nora's own hearing, by a woman who did not see her, rendered this time not with cruelty, but with the absent confidence of someone for whom the category of person Nora was did not require the courtesy of invisibility. Nora was furniture. Furniture could absorb the truth of itself without protest. Nora set Mrs. Liesel's tea tray down and excused herself. She went to her room and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and held the note in her hands. The room was cold because the fire had burned down, and she had not rung for it to be set again. The wallpaper, which was a faded green stripe, had been selected by someone 20 years ago who had been managing an expenditure, and the effect was of something that had aspired, once, to pleasantness, and had been aspirating ever since. She had spent 2 seasons in rooms like this. She had 300 books from her father's library stored with Mrs. Hartley in Fenby, including his parish registers, including the one that contained the baptismal entry for Margaret Finch. She had brought one of those registers to London because it had seemed important not to leave it where her father's successor could find it, and that she had not known when she left Fenby what she might need. She had not known, then, that she would need to be brave. She had thought she would need to be quiet. She opened the battered leather record book she kept at the bottom of her valise, her father's handwriting and meticulous entries filling 40 years of Fenby's quiet history, and she turned to the page dated the autumn of 1789, and she read the baptismal entry for Margaret Ann Finch in her father's careful hand, and she closed the book, and she made a decision. She was tired of being quiet. She had been quiet her entire life, and it had not made her safer. It had only made her smaller, and somewhat easier to ignore. She put the record book in her reticule. She dressed for the evening. The Penworth musical evening was in its second week. The soprano was the same soprano. The candles were the same candles, and the paneling was still late Stuart. Lord and Lady Penworth invited the same 40 bodies back each Thursday because they could afford nothing more original, and the 40 bodies returned each Thursday because there was nowhere better to go at 10 o'clock on a Thursday in the third week of February, and because the wine was reliable, and because 40 people in a room generate enough conversational cross-current that nearly any private business can be conducted in plain sight. Nora stood near the pianoforte. She held Mrs. Lysel's shawl. She watched the room. Lady Gresham arrived at 9:30 with Lady Cecily Mordaunt on one side and the solicitor-shaped man on the other, and she moved through the room with the specific confidence of a woman who believes she has already won. Her fan was open. Her jewels caught the candlelight and distributed it with the generous indifference of jewels that have never had occasion to be modest. She settled near the fire in the same chair at the same angle, and accepted greetings with the measured warmth of someone who is prepared to be gracious, because graciousness is, in the present moment, more satisfying than anything else available to her. She was halfway across the floor when Lord Atherstone walked in. He was alone. He had not, Nora noticed with the precise peripheral vision of someone who has learned to see without appearing to look, brought anyone with him. No agents, no solicitor-shaped men, no procedural authority to manage the room. He was in evening dress, and he looked, if she were being accurate, exactly like a man who had made a decision and arrived to confirm it. There was nothing tentative in how he moved. The tiredness was still there, and would be for some time yet. But it was not, tonight, in command. He crossed the room directly to Lord Penworth, with whom he spent 2 minutes in quiet conversation, and then he turned. His gaze found her. She did not look away. She had decided, in her small, cold room with the green stripe wallpaper and the record book in her reticule, not to look away from things anymore. He moved through the room. The 40 bodies, as bodies will, registered his movement without appearing to, and conversation slowed by half a degree, and fans paused mid-motion, and the soprano finished her phrase and accepted the polite applause without anyone fully attending to her, because attending to the soprano had ceased, momentarily, to be the most interesting thing available. Lady Gresham saw him and began to close the distance. Her fan was up. He reached Nora first. The note was false, he said. His voice was low and directed entirely at her, with the precision of a man who has learned that clarity is the most efficient form of apology. Lady Gresham sent it. I was at the magistrate's office to secure Finch's release, not to confirm the charge. He is at liberty. He is presently in a position that will keep him so. She held his gaze. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which had moved to somewhere high in her chest, and of the warmth of the room, and of the 40 people who were very carefully not watching them. The Duke of Carwell, he continued, knows his wife's origins. He knew them before the marriage. He had made his own inquiries before accepting Lady Gresham's account, and found that the account was incomplete, and he had chosen, for reasons that were his own, to proceed regardless. What he did not know was the extent of the concealment Lady Gresham had undertaken on his behalf, and what had been done in the last week to protect that concealment. That is the truth I brought to him 2 days ago, and he has confirmed in writing that the matter of his wife's origins does not alter his regard for her, and that the management of the situation going forward is his own concern and not Lady Gresham's. He paused. The matter is closed. He paused again, and she could see him deciding something. I should have told you sooner, he said. I am sorry. She did not have words for this immediately. She had expected several things when he crossed the room, and she had prepared for several of them, but the apology, stated plainly and without defense, had taken the composure she had been preparing and replaced it with something warmer and considerably less useful to the present moment. Lady Gresham arrived at their side with the economy of a woman who has spent 40 years deploying well-timed arrivals. "Lord Atherstone," she said, and the smile in her voice was very good indeed. Measured and warm. The precise temperature of a woman who is entirely in control. "I think you will find that Miss Ashby has caused sufficient difficulty for one season. A country nobody who cannot be trusted to keep what she knows. Miss Ashby is under my protection." He said it quietly, turned toward Lady Gresham, the words level and entirely unhurried, placed in the room with the same care he placed all his words. "I will not have her silenced." The room did not stop. It did not gasp. It did nothing so theatrical as register the moment with any single audible response. The room heard. 40 people heard, the way a room hears when a man of a particular rank speaks a particular kind of sentence in a particular kind of voice, which is to say, they heard it, and they absorbed it, and they would not forget it, and they would consider it carefully in the morning over their breakfast trays, and come, most of them, to the only available conclusion. The season was a machine for producing verdicts, and it had just produced one, and this one was not Lady Gresham's. Lady Gresham's fan did not move for 3 full seconds. Nora counted them. Then Lady Gresham said, with the careful precision of a woman absorbing a public correction and choosing, with considerable dignity, not to collapse under it, "How very kind of you, my lord," and turned back to the room with the particular bearing of someone who understands they are displaced, but will not give the satisfaction of a scene. Lady Cecily Mordaunt looked from Lord Atherstone to Nora and back, and something in her expression resolved itself, not with malice, and not with generosity, but with the clean and slightly flat recognition of a woman who has just understood that the field has changed and that understanding it clearly is the most useful thing available to her. Nora stood very still. He turned back to her. The room went on around them. The soprano, entirely unaware of the whole of it, began her next piece. Something in a minor key, slow and somewhat plaintive, which was, under the circumstances, almost appropriate. "I would like to call on you tomorrow," he said, "if Mrs. Liesel will receive me." Nora thought of her father's record book in her reticule, pressing lightly against her side. She thought of Jonas, at liberty. She thought of Margaret Finch, who had been born a chandler's daughter, and was still in all the ways that mattered. The woman the Duke had met in a land agent's house in the north, and chosen to spend his life alongside. She thought of the name in the register, written in her father's careful hand, and she thought of the name she might, in time, write there herself. "She will receive you," Nora said. 6 weeks later, on a morning when the last of the season's frost was on the glass, and the fire in the small sitting room of the Liesel house was burning with the cheerful industry of a fire that knows it is useful, she sat across from him and put the parish record book on the low table between them. He looked at it. He did not immediately reach for it. "My father's," she said. "The baptismal register for St. Cuthbert's, Fenby, from 1775 to 1818. Margaret Finch is in it. Autumn of 1789. She smoothed the worn leather cover with one hand, a gesture she had made many times over the past weeks. Not quite a habit, and not quite a comfort, but something between them. I carried it to London because I did not know what else to do with it, and I could not leave it in the parish because my father's successor does not know it exists, and it was safer with me than in a locked box in a place I could not watch." She stopped. "I have had it in my valise for 2 months," she said. and I have been trying to decide what it means that I have been walking around with a piece of evidence in a case that is now closed." Edmund was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. Outside the window, London continued its season in its usual manner, entirely indifferent to what was happening in this particular room. "It means," he said, "that you did not yet know whether to trust me." She looked at him. "Yes." "And now?" She pushed the book across the table. He took it with both hands, the way you take something that is being offered seriously and understand that the offer is not primarily about the object. He held it a moment without opening it, and he looked at her across the small distance of the table, and the gray eyes in the morning light were not tired in the way she had first seen them, or they were tired still. The grief was not finished, and would not be finished for some time. Grief being the kind of thing that finishes on its own schedule and does not much consult the living. But there was something alongside it now that had not been there at the first evening. The particular quality of a man who has been witnessed and has not, this time, flinched from what the witnessing revealed. "You came from somewhere," he said. "You do not have to apologize for it." She breathed. The fire crackled. A coal shifted and resettled with a small, bright collapse of heat. "No," she said. "I do not." He opened the book to the first page, which was her father's handwriting in the careful ink of a man who believed that records mattered and that the work of keeping them accurately was itself a form of honesty. He read it the way you read something you intend to remember, line by careful line, and she watched him read it, and the morning light lay across both of them in the particular way of February light that has decided, finally, to become March. She thought of her father, who had believed that silence was safety and been wrong about it. She thought of Margaret Finch, who had built a whole life on a carefully tended silence and found that the Duke had known all along and not required the silence at all. She thought of Jonas, who was presently employed by the Duke's steward in a modest but dignified capacity, which was the kind of resolution that did not look like any kind of justice you might have imagined, but was, in practice, more durable than most. She thought of the moment in the garden when she had pushed the truth across the table toward a man she did not know, and the moment in a drawing room when he had crossed a room toward her and said her name in front of 40 people, and the quality of those two moments, which were perhaps the same moment seen from either end. Edmund closed the book. He set it on his side of the table. He looked at her. "I have spoken with my solicitor," he said, "regarding certain practical matters that would require your consideration and your formal response before any further steps are taken." He paused. "I have also thought carefully about whether a man who is still finding his way back from where I have been is, in present circumstances, an advisable choice." Another pause, shorter. "I have concluded that advisable choices have been the wrong kind of advice for some time." She looked at him steadily. "That is a very careful way of asking something," she said. Something moved in the corner of his mouth. The thing she had noticed at their first meeting in the corridor. The thing she had not been quite able to name. She could name it now. "Yes," he said. "It is." She reached across the table and picked up the parish register and held it for a moment. Then she set it back down, on his side. "Ask me properly," she said. Outside, the frost on the glass continued to melt. Somewhere in the house, a kettle was set to boil, and the ordinary sound of it was, in the particular circumstances, the most welcome sound she had ever heard. Her father had kept the truth in a book, and the book had survived him. And she had carried it to London, and it had not destroyed her. It had, against all reasonable expectation, led her here. She had spent 24 years making herself quiet. She had spent 2 months walking through London with the truth in her valise. She thought, on the whole, that she had chosen the right morning to set it down. Thank you for staying until the end. If Nora's courage has stayed with you, leave a word in the comments and come back for the next story.